I'm so delighted to welcome you here. This is a wonderful collaboration between the Jewish Federation of Springfield and the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum. And I'm really thrilled that all of you are here. I can't think of a better way to spend a Sunday evening than to see this exhibit, which is extraordinary, and also to have a good time together. So it's really very special. I know you will also enjoy Daniel Stowell's talk. Let me firstly thank the donors who have made this extraordinary exhibit possible. Some of the donors are here with us this evening. Lisa and Stephen Stone, Natalie and Bob Silver, Joan and Bob Feitler are not here, but they send their wishes from Chicago. Jean and Bill Soman send their wishes from Florida, and they will be here. Janine and Ira Marks Family Foundation were here with us at the opening, but not tonight. I want to especially thank Natalie Silverman this evening because I don't know how many of you are members of Hadassah, but there's an exceptional story in here about our Lincoln exhibit. I know many of you have wonderful connections with organizations, women's organizations, men's organizations, professional organizations, and we still have a fair amount of time that this exhibit will be here. Please reach out. I also know that there are some people here from St. Louis, and I would like to give a special round of applause for those who came here from St. Louis, and also ask you if you would reach out to me at the end of this program or during the exhibit, because we'd like to form an informal group, if you will, of people who are from St. Louis, who come to this museum or who would like to come to the museum, and for which we would like to then exchange opportunities to visit St. Louis. So this is a good pretext for an ongoing relationship. Again, thank you, donors, very much. It's now my pleasure to introduce our other half of this program, if you will. I had the pleasure to meet Josephine Gahn because of this program, and everyone liked the opportunity in my staff to say, now, what's that accent? And then, of course, she told us that it was from South Africa, and that everyone then wanted to be from South Africa because it has a particular lilt and a great charm. So that is where it is. And I also see, if my eyesight doesn't deceive me, that Jay Mogerman is here as well. And if I can, I would like to take one moment to tell you about Jay Mogerman. I know everybody knows a great deal about him, but when this exhibit was just a possibility, Jay came into my office and said, we want to be partners. We want to make sure that this happens. And I said, well, I'm not sure the exhibit's going to happen. There's a lot of pieces that have to be put together. And he said, I have faith this will happen, and we want to be part of it. And that's Jay Mogerman for you. Now let me introduce Josephine Gahn.
Thank you, Eileen. Actually, I was hoping Jay would be doing what I'm doing, but he just walked in. Eileen has thanked many people, and we're thrilled to be able to partner with you on this event. It just sort of seemed like a natural fit. Actually, interestingly enough, this comes on the second of such an event. If for those of you who were there with the Federation and the temples, was it one or both, did one on Lincoln and the Jews with Gary Zola. Earlier in the year. So, and that was fascinating, and I know Gary Zola was here. So this is perfect, and I just wanted to extend my own thanks to Jay for chairing the committee that was responsible for this, and also at the library, the museum, Catherine Parker, and who checked you in there, and Sabrina Mancy as well for all their work on this. And so thank you for the Education and Culture Committee of the Federation. I apologize for the back and forth with times. There's been a bit of confusion, but nevertheless. So with that, thank you. And will you introduce our speaker? Thank you.
I think confusion is underrated. It gives you more opportunity to talk to each other and say, there may be a bit of confusion, but guess what? This is really happening. So the more times we do that with confusion as the pretext, the more reason we have to guarantee that there will be a wonderful crowd today. So I'm delighted. Let me also just take a moment to tell you about some of the other events that will take place. Of course, the exhibit is the main star, and Daniel Stowell is the curator who really worked assiduously with our design team and with the designers from the Shapell Foundation to make this exhibit possible within a very small space and within a very short period of time. We also will have 3 other events. October 3rd, everyone's Jewish American musical songbook. And of course, I'm talking about everyone from Jerome Kern until Stephen Sondheim. And you can count all those that go in the middle that you all know and love their music. In fact, the only person who's not Jewish in that large pantheon of stars is Cole Porter. And the famous story about Cole Porter talking to Isaac Balin, who was, of course, another person named Irving Berlin, he said to him, you know, I can do Yiddish too. And of course he meant it because he had picked up the melodious tone. Another program is, of course, Jonathan Sarna is coming here on October 15th. Please sign up to come. I know it will be a very special opportunity to hear his perspective on the book and how it came together, and perhaps also working with Ben Shapell and the extraordinary collection that we know Ben Shapell has. And finally, a perspective on American Jewish history with Hasia Diner from NYU. I have loved her book on the peddlers because the peddlers, of course, wound up to be Julius Rosenwald. They wound up to be Julius Levi from Levi's and I. Magnin and Bergdorf Goodman, and we could go on and on and on. But she will talk about the role that the peddlers have played in creating a cosmopolitan America and in cementing capitalism. So it's an interesting talk that she will give. 3 evenings. Tonight will not be just an ordinary evening. I have had the opportunity, one of the great pleasures of being the director is to be able to work with Daniel Stowell. It's not just that he is the editor of the papers of Abraham Lincoln, and that most recently we got the 2nd largest grant from the federal government on for the papers, and that was about $400,000. Of course, there's matching involved, and we have to be aware of that, but an extraordinary gift to our very special papers and extraordinary intellectual project at the museum. But he is also in charge of the Center for Digital Initiatives, which is our major effort here at the museum to get everything in our collections out so that people really know what we have, the diversity of what we have. Of course, our Lincoln material, vast and unsurpassed. But in addition to that, we have extraordinary stories of Illinois. So that chronicling Illinois has been his baby, but the whole concept of the Center for Digital Initiatives is a wonderful story of our growth and development. Of course, he's not only an administrator, he's an exceptional scholar. And he brings a great deal to this discussion of Jews and Lincoln, with firstly his knowledge about Lincoln, but secondly the fact that he is a scholar of American religions. He has written a book that's widely regarded called Rebuilding Zion, Religious Reconstruction of the South in the period of the Civil War and after. So it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend, Daniel Stowell.
Thank you, Eileen. I first became acquainted with Benjamin Shapell in 2001. When he became the first individual to make a donation to the papers of Abraham Lincoln. At that time, the project of which I had recently become the director was the Lincoln Legal Papers, dedicated to locating all documents related to Lincoln's quarter-century legal career. In 2001, the Illinois Historic Preservation Agency agreed to expand our mission into the papers of Abraham Lincoln, and the Lincoln Legal Papers became the first series in that larger project. Mr. Shapell's donation at that time was only the first of a series of donations over the past decade and a half. He has long believed in the mission of the Papers of Abraham Lincoln to identify, image, transcribe, annotate, and publish freely online all documents written by or to Abraham Lincoln during his entire lifetime. Mr. Shapell's parents immigrated from Poland to the United States in the early 1950s. When I was writing this, I wrote 1850s. It's just a habit, but 1950s. And his father and uncle began a Los Angeles real estate company in 1955. Over the next half-century, Shapell Industries constructed 70,000 homes in California. Born in California, Benjamin Shapell graduated from the University of Southern California, and he holds dual citizenship in the United States and Israel and has homes in Beverly Hills and outside Tel Aviv. Mr. Shapell's passion for historical documents related to the history of the Jewish people, American interactions in the 19th and 20th centuries with the Holy Land, and Abraham Lincoln led him to create the Shapell Manuscript Foundation in 2004. Although the Foundation's collections are particularly rich in presidents, Mark Twain, the Civil War, Judaica, and even the Old West and George Armstrong Custer, I will focus on his remarkable collection of Lincoln manuscripts. Numbering more than 100 items assembled over 35 years, the Shapell Manuscript Foundation's Lincoln collection is rich in letters written by Abraham Lincoln, both before and during his presidency. Among the many highlights are the following: a leaf from teenaged Abraham Lincoln's arithmetic copybook, the oldest known document, scattered in different repositories, but the oldest known Lincoln document in existence. 2 letters from the mid-1840s to Andrew Johnston, not his future vice president, but Andrew Johnston, Lincoln's friend in Quincy, enclosing a poem Lincoln wrote, beginning, "My childhood home I see again," and a copy of The Political Debates Between Honorable Abraham Lincoln and Honorable Stephen A. Douglas, inscribed to Lincoln's second law partner, Stephen T. Logan. Some of the letters are filled with pithy Lincoln observations, such as a letter of introduction he gave to the mother of 2 sons who wanted to work. Let them at it, if possible. Wanting to work is so rare a want that it should be encouraged. The Shapell Manuscript Collection includes perhaps the most famous of Lincoln's private letters, that to Grace Bedell, his 11-year-old supporter in western New York, who urged Lincoln in October 1860 to grow a beard, because you would look a great deal better, for your face is so thin. Lincoln responded, "As to whiskers, having never worn any, do you not think people would call it a piece of silly affectation if I were to begin it now?" Of course, Lincoln did grow a beard, was elected president, and even met young Grace Bedell on his journey to Washington a few months later. Other treasures abound, including the touching letter Lincoln wrote to the teenager Fanny McCullough, whose father had been killed in battle. Lincoln knew her father personally, and he wrote as a concerned family friend. In this sad world of ours, sorrow comes to all, and to the young it comes with bitterest agony, because it takes them unawares. The older have learned to ever expect it. I am anxious to afford some alleviation of your present distress. Perfect relief is not possible except with time. You cannot now realize that you will ever feel better. Is not this so? And yet it is a mistake. You are sure to be happy again. To know this, which is certainly true, will make you some less miserable now. I have had experience enough to know what I say, and you need only to believe it to feel better at once. I should add this was written a few months after Lincoln lost his second son to death and to disease, Willie Lincoln, in early 1862. The Shapell Manuscript Collection includes a signed copy of the Emancipation Proclamation, one of 48 printed copies signed by the President and sold to raise money for the benefit of the soldiers. Additional documents in the collection reveal aspects of Lincoln as a father, from a check to Robert Lincoln for $25 to a note to an Army officer asking that he give Tad a map or two for which he will ask. Our overlapping interest in Lincoln documents gave Mr. Shapell and me a reason to correspond occasionally about specific documents or research questions. By late 2011, he was interested in supporting the search for Lincoln Judaica-related documents in a more intensive manner. I suggested that since our project staff were going through millions of pages at the National Archives looking for documents written by and to Lincoln, it might be more productive to search our results for Jewish content rather than search anew, specifically letters to, from, or about individual Jews in Lincoln's America. We settled upon a plan for Mr. Shapell to hire an image processor who would assist our project by taking master image files of several hundred megabytes each and converting them into usable portable document format or PDF files. While doing so, he would keep an eye out for Jewish names and subjects. The process was very, very beneficial for both the Papers of Abraham Lincoln and the Shapell Manuscript Foundation. Over the next 3 years, Greg Hapke, who holds a master's degree in history from Illinois State University, converted nearly 200,000 pages of master image files into 63,414 PDFs for the Papers of Abraham Lincoln. Along the way, he found scores of documents that helped to illuminate Lincoln's relationships with individual Jews to the Shapell Manuscript Foundation. Over the course of our relationship, we've also shared some similar personal losses. My father passed away at age 89 in February 2014, and almost exactly 1 year later, Mr. Shapell's father, a Holocaust survivor, also passed away at age 94. We shared email condolences with each other. By 2013, the Shapell Manuscript Foundation began planning both a book and an exhibit to highlight the new information they had uncovered about Lincoln's interactions with numerous Jews. We here at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum were, of course, eager to host this exhibit, and we met with Mr. Shapell in March 2013 to explore the possibility. Ultimately, the exhibit opened at the New York Historical Society in March of this year to correspond with the publication of Lincoln and the Jews, A History, a beautiful volume written by Professor Jonathan Sarna and Benjamin Shapell. Both the book and the exhibit draw heavily on the collections of the Shapell Manuscript Foundation. I had the pleasure of attending the opening of the exhibit in New York, and I am more than delighted that we now have, with Firmness in the Right, Lincoln and the Jews, here at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum. There were several challenges in making With Firmness in the Right a successful exhibit here. First, we chose early on to use the Treasures Gallery as the venue for the exhibit. In the 10 years that the Presidential Museum has been open, this exhibit is the first to come from outside the institution to this space. Previously, we had always highlighted the extraordinary documents and artifacts of our own Lincoln collection. Second, those of you who are familiar with the Presidential Museum will also know that the space was originally designed more as a browsing area with several standing cases and then a vault area that held our most valuable treasures, such as Lincoln's hat, the Gettysburg Address, or the signed copies of the Emancipation Proclamation or the 13th Amendment. With Firmness in the Right tells an essentially chronological story of Lincoln's interactions with Jewish Americans. Our creative exhibit staff and a design firm from New York had to reorient the space to direct visitors through a chronological progression of materials. Also challenging was how to integrate the vault area into such a narrative while retaining its symbolism as the most important piece and the climax of the narrative. Third, the Treasures Gallery is substantially smaller than the space available at the New York Historical Society, so we needed to decide how to scale the exhibit for the space available. Some choices were relatively simple, as the exhibit in New York tells some basic aspects of the Lincoln story that are covered elsewhere here in the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Museum. However, there were other hard choices and even a few additions. We leave it to you to judge whether we have been successful in telling a compelling story about Lincoln and the Jews. Given Mr. Shapell's twin interests in Judaica and Lincoln, it is unsurprising that the Shapell Manuscript Foundation holds many pieces of Lincoln's correspondence with or about Jews. Several of those documents are on display in With Firmness in the Right. Among the highlights are an 1856 letter by Abraham Lincoln on the court circuit in Urbana, Illinois, to Abraham Jonas, his friend and political ally across the state in Quincy, regretting that he could not meet a speaking engagement. Also, an 1864 order for a 3-week parole for Charles H. Jonas, son of Abraham Jonas, Confederate soldier and prisoner of war in Ohio, to go to visit his dying father in Quincy, Illinois. The collection also includes 2 testimonials for Issachar Zachary, a chiropodist or podiatrist, who removed some corns from Lincoln's feet and went on to render greater services to the Union cause. One of the additions to the exhibit here that was not at the New York Historical Society is a tracing of Lincoln's feet made by a bootmaker late in 1864. Although the bootmaker was not Jewish, the tracings complement the Zachary story by humanizing Lincoln. Thanks to reproductions of the tracings on the floor leading to the Treasures Gallery, you can compare your feet to Lincoln's and see if you could fill his shoes. Incidentally, the bootmaker from Pennsylvania sent the boots to Lincoln in February 1865. When he received only a polite thank you note from Lincoln's secretary in March, he was initially angry that he had not received payment for the boots. Later, a friend convinced him the thank you note was worth more in advertising than the cost of a single pair of boots, and he moved his business to New York City and became the bootmaker to presidents, proudly displaying the tracing of Lincoln's feet and note in his store. I want briefly to call your attention to an aspect of the exhibit that you can easily overlook, but which is significant in what it tells us about both Lincoln and Lincoln's America. Abraham and Mary Lincoln and their son Robert visited Grover's Theater to see Gamia, or the Jewish Mother, starring Felicita Vesvali, on its opening night of January 25, 1864. Grover's Theater was the main competitor to Ford's Theater and was located only 3 blocks from the Executive Mansion down Pennsylvania Avenue toward the Capitol. Vesvali starred in the role for 4 successive nights, and some evidence suggests the Lincolns returned to Grover's to see her again on the closing night of January 28th. Perhaps this tragic story of a mother who had lost her daughter to another appealed to the war-weary president, whom some Republicans were seeking to replace with another candidate in the presidential election later that year. Gamia, or the Jewish Mother, was an English adaptation of the 1859 French play The Fortune Teller by Victor Séjour, an American mulatto expatriate, and Jean-Francois Mocard, Chief of Staff and Private Secretary to Napoleon III. In France, Séjour found anti-Semitism to be a powerful symbol for the racism he had experienced as the child of free black parents in New Orleans. In the first short story published by an African American, The Mulatto, 1837, Séjour condemned New World slavery. In his first play, The Jew of Seville, in 1844, he turned his attention to the intolerance of the Spanish Inquisition in the Old World. Now, in The Fortune Teller, Séjour again attacked the anti-Semitism of Europe, and through it, both the racism and the anti-Semitism of North America. Set in Italy in the 18th century, The Fortune Teller follows the travails of a Jewish family who lose their daughter when a nurse secretly baptizes her and she is taken away to be raised as a Christian. The play is an overt commentary on the internationally famous case of Edgardo Mortara, an Italian Jewish child taken from his family and raised as a Catholic. A servant girl had secretly baptized Edgardo when he was an infant because she feared he would die unbaptized. In 1858, police seized 6-year-old Edgardo from his parents' home in Bologna to transport him to Rome to be raised as a ward of the state. Roman Catholic doctrine insisted that Christian children could only be reared by Christians. Pope Pius IX supported the seizure and even took a personal interest in the case. Edgardo's parents were allowed to visit him, but only under supervision. By the time Italian unification included Rome in 1870, Edgardo Mortara was an adult and was firmly committed to remaining a Roman Catholic. Ordained a priest at age 23, Mortara became a missionary to Jews in several European cities. Both Jewish and Christian organizations and leaders around the world, including even Napoleon III, protested the boy's seizure. President James Buchanan refused to intervene, explaining he had no power nor desire to interfere in the domestic affairs of foreign nations. Other reasons seem more important. Buchanan did not wish to alienate the large number of Irish Catholic voters who had long supported the Democratic Party by criticizing the actions of the Pope. Neither did Buchanan wish to invite foreign comment upon the domestic institution of American slavery that routinely separated children from parents and spouses from each other. The parallels between Gamia's anguish, the Mortara's calamity, and the adversity of millions of enslaved African Americans would have been clear to Abraham Lincoln. In 1863, Matilda Heron, an Irish actress and playwright, adapted Séjour and Mocard's fortune teller into Gamia, or the Jewish mother, specifically for Felicita Westphali. Heron's composer husband, Robert Stowell, provided incidental music, including the mystic chant, the mother's prayer, and the cradle song. Nearly 1 year after viewing Gamia, Abraham and Mary Lincoln took their youngest son, Tad, to see another Jewish-themed play at Grover's Theater. The play this evening, January 7th, 1865, was Leah the Forsaken, starring Avonia Jones. Little piece of trivia here. If you watch Lincoln, the movie by Steven Spielberg, there's a scene in which Tad mentions that they've been to the theater to see Avonia Jones. It's this play. Leah had its origins in Hungary, where Salomon Hermann Mosenthal, a German Jewish dramatist and poet, published Deborah in 1849 in Budapest. Mosenthal's play was translated into several languages, and Augustin Daly, playwright and theater manager, adapted it into English as Leah the Forsaken in 1862. After very successful runs in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and London, the play came to Washington in January 1865 with Avonia Jones as the tragic heroine. Although only 25 years old, Jones was already being hailed as the admitted high priestess of tragedy, the female equivalent of Edwin Booth. Set in an 18th century Austrian village, Leah the Forsaken tells the story of Leah, the daughter of a rabbi, who falls in love with Rudolph, the son of the village's old Christian magistrate. Her name would remind both Jewish and Christian audiences of Leah, the wife of the patriarch Jacob, whom he did not love as much as he did her sister Rachel. Very familiar with the text of the Bible, Lincoln would have understood the allusion to the Old Testament story of Jacob and how his intense love for her sister Rachel left Leah feeling forsaken, even after she gave birth to 6 of his sons. In Daly's play, Leah first appears as an outcast pursued by peasants, their passions whipped up by a secret Jewish apostate named Nathan. They shout vile accusations at the Jews. They poison our wells and fountains, and they devour little children as a sacrifice on Passover. Nathan, fearing exposure as a Jew, is the most malevolent character, accusing Jews of haunting Austria's villages to beg, to steal, or to wheedle money from the unsuspecting. It is part of their faith and of being a soulless and a grasping race who value more the chink of gold than all the virtues of humanity strung together. To Rudolph, Leah represents an exotic, forbidden love, wildly beautiful, yet pitiable as part of a despised race. Leah and Rudolph pledge themselves to one another and make plans to wander through the desert into the promised land of America, to plow the soil and on it rear the altar of a new religion that shall teach love and brotherhood to all men. Through a cruel ruse, Nathan thwarts these happy plans, misleading Rudolph into believing that Leah valued money more than his love. Believing Leah to be an enchantress and a huckster, Rudolph decides to marry a Christian named Madalena. But on the very eve of that marriage, he realizes his error and begs forgiveness. Leah refuses and curses him, but Rudolph, in contrition, becomes an advocate for the Jews and names his own daughter Leah. He even visits the emperor to plead for the rights of Jews to remain in the village. The emperor in the play must have seemed familiar to Lincoln. He was a plainly dressed, mild-looking man whose doors were wide open. Everybody goes to him, and everybody finds place in his turn. Perhaps Daly even thought of Lincoln's famous accessibility when he adapted the play into English. The emperor approves Rudolph's plea, declaring, "Let them stay. The laws of exile are of ancient date. I will make a new law. I myself am anxious that all my subjects should be equal. For Jew or Christian, they all belong to me." So in the end, Rudolph and Leah reconcile. Nathan is unmasked as a scheming apostate, and Leah resolves to leave with her people for America, the far-off, promised land. George William Curtis, the anti-slavery editor of Harper's Weekly, insisted that Leah also carried a more universal message, applicable to the Civil War era. This moral, indeed, may have been what inspired the Lincolns to see the play with Tad. To Curtis, the anti-Semitic peasants of 18th century Austria had their counterparts in the 19th century United States, those who appeal to the popular prejudice against an outcast race. If in Europe the question was whether a Jew might be equal to a Christian, in America it was, is a Negro equal to a white man? Leah thus served as an object lesson for Americans. Upon this hatred of race, according to Curtis, reactionaries sought to gain power, in order to abase, divide, and destroy this nation. Proclaiming the play a powerful sermon that was nightly preached, Curtis urged his readers, "Go and see Leah and have the lesson burned in upon your mind, which may help to save the national life and honor." Compared to the overt hostility Jews faced in most European nations, kingdoms, and empires of the time, the United States may indeed have seemed like the promised land. However, anti-Semitism in mid-19th century America was both casual and pervasive, as this exhibit makes clear in its exploration of the attitudes of several of Lincoln's generals. In spite of this anti-Semitic environment, Gamia and Leah were two of at least three melodramas that played in wartime Washington featuring Jewish heroines. Both plays urged their audience to feel sympathy for the Jewish heroines and to be repulsed by the harsh anti-Semitism of their European persecutors. That such anti-Semitic plays were performed in the nation's capital is remarkable. That Lincoln attended performances of both Gamia and Leah is a particularly significant indication of his attitude toward the Jewish people. Mr. Shapell and I share a particular appreciation for Lincoln's second inaugural address. I consider it to be his best speech. In the vault area of this exhibit, you will see three important documents related to that magnificent piece of oratory. First, there is a portion of the speech that Lincoln wrote out for an admirer in the weeks after the address. Both parties deprecated war, but one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive, and the other would accept war rather than let it perish, and the war came. This transcription in Lincoln's hand is part of the Shapell manuscript collection. Second, you will see another portion of the second inaugural address that Lincoln wrote out for Mrs. Amanda Hall, whose brother was a congressman. "Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled up by the bondman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether." Finally, you'll see my favorite document in the exhibit, which is no easy task to have a favorite. It is a letter to Thurlow Weed, a newspaper editor and political advisor in New York, in which Lincoln reflects on his own recent inaugural address. It is an exceedingly rare evaluation of Lincoln by Lincoln. Written 1 month before his death, the president wrote that he expected his second inaugural address to wear as well as, perhaps better than, anything I have produced, but I believe it is not immediately popular. Men are not flattered by being shown that there has been a difference of purpose between the Almighty and them. To deny it, however, in this case, is to deny that there is a God governing the world. It is a truth which needed to be told. And as whatever of humiliation there is in it falls most directly on myself, I thought others might afford for me to tell it. What an amazing display of stern resolve wrapped in selfless humility, a truth that needed to be told. It is a summary of Lincoln's approach to the entire Civil War and the human slavery that led to it. Too often, historians and politicians recite part of the closing paragraph of Lincoln's great speech, "With malice toward none, with charity for all." In doing so, they stop too short. The next lines are equally important. "With firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right." Not arrogant or condescending, but resolved and determined. That was Abraham Lincoln's attitude toward many issues and many groups of people. "With firmness in the right" is an apt title for this exhibit, because through it we see a story of Lincoln's interactions with individual Jews, and we see how that Jewish thread woven together with other threads, produces the grandeur of the second inaugural address. I'm very proud to have played a part in bringing with firmness in the right Lincoln and the Jews to the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library Museum. I hope you enjoy it, learn from it, and are inspired by it. Thank you. And I won't be able to see you because the lights are really bright here. Oh. The question is what? Okay. The question is what things were taken out of the Historical Society exhibit and what was added here. A couple of things were added here. I mentioned already the tracing of Lincoln's feet and the pass that allowed the bootmaker into the White House. The other thing that I can recall off the top of my head is an additional document that it may have been in the New York exhibit in facsimile form from the National Archives, but which is original here. As far as things that have been removed, as I mentioned, a couple of things related to the Lincoln story. For example, the 1860 election. Visitors to this institution don't really need that part of the story. At the New York Historical Society, they need sort of the context of Lincoln's career. And the other thing that reminds me, or that I can think of, that was removed was a section on the New York City draft riots, and again, that was sort of specific to New York. It was a really great part of the exhibit because it had a draft wheel, which is kind of like a big barrel that they put names in, and then they rolled it sort of Wheel of Fortune or game show style, and drew names out for the draft, but unfortunately that artifact could not travel, and so that was really the centerpiece of that portion of the exhibit. So those are two examples, the 1860 election sort of portion. I think there's a little bit more, there was a little bit more in that portion of the exhibit about the assassination, and again, that story is well told here in the museum largely, so it's a part of Lincoln's larger story. I think the New York City draft riots are really the piece that we wish we could have had, but the artifact couldn't travel. Oh.
Two questions. One, did Mr. Shapell actually give the library some documents, or are they on loan? And also, is the Shapell manuscripts, are they on exhibit that one can go and see them, or is it in their personal library?
First question is, did Mr. Shapell give any of the documents to the Library Museum? The answer to that is no. These are all on loan. The second question is, are they on display anywhere? The Shapell Manuscript Foundation does have a website that shows many of the documents that he has, not all of the documents, but you're able to see nice digital images and transcriptions there. But the documents themselves, if they are not on display in various exhibits, the Shapell Manuscript Foundation loaned a number of documents to the Library of Congress in 2009 for a wonderful bicentennial exhibit, the Bicentennial of Lincoln's Birth exhibit. So if they're not on display here or at other institutions, they are privately held.
Yes. Daniel, would you share with us Lincoln's view of the Holy Land?
The question is, what is Lincoln's view about the Holy Land? There are a couple of pieces to that puzzle. Mary Lincoln reflected afterwards, and I believe this quotation is on the wall at the end of this exhibit, that Lincoln was looking forward to, after his second term as president, to traveling, and he certainly wanted to go to Europe and to the Holy Land, and so that was a plan. And there's another quotation, I was thinking it was attributed to Mary as well, but it may have been someone else, where Lincoln reflected that he would like to see Jerusalem before, the quote is, "I'd like to see Jerusalem before I die." So there was definitely an interest in going there. And of course, Lincoln actually never traveled outside the boundaries of the United States.
And you know, there was another portion of the exhibit that wasn't in your painting that's at the very fine Nelson Atkins Museum, not too far from us here, and that deals with an Orientalist vision of Jerusalem, a very interesting painting that accompanied that quotation.
Okay,
Yes, in the back.
I'm going to get to you. The question is, what was Mary Lincoln's attitude toward Jews, and was she similarly enlightened? And I confess I haven't seen any documentation where she reflects. I haven't seen any anti-Semitism in her writings, but I also haven't seen any specific reflections on Jews as a class. Yes, ma'am. For those of you who don't know, General Ulysses S. Grant issued an order expelling all Jews from the area under his command. What he was intending to do, I believe, this is open for interpretation, was he was intending to address an abuse of traders, some of whom were Jews, both in trading in cotton, southern cotton, but also in sort of hindering his operations as a military commander. What he did do was to single out Jews as a class, and that not only dealt with traders that were with his army, and I'm saying traders, not traitors, traders who were with his army, but it also applied because his command extended all the way back from northern Mississippi all the way back basically to the Ohio River. So what the result of that order was to expel Jews who had been merchants in Paducah, Kentucky for decades from their homes and their businesses. When Lincoln learned of it, he immediately had General Halleck overturn that order, and Grant, to his credit, basically spent the rest of his life trying to live it down. And he does go on to appoint a number of Jews, when he is president, to positions. Now, I'm not trying to minimize his order. His order was a really bad decision, but I am trying to contextualize that.
Yes.
Aside from courthouses, where do you look for other Lincoln documents, particularly linked to Judaism or Jews?
It's a great question. The question is basically, where do we look for Lincoln documents? As the director of the Papers of Abraham Lincoln, the kind of short answer is everywhere. They sometimes walk in the door of this institution. We find them on eBay. We find them at auction houses. We find descendants who come forward and say that they have documents. We build on, databases that have been developed in years past. One of the things that Mr. Shapell has been remarkably successful in doing is flushing out some documents that are in private collections that haven't been seen for 30 or 40 or 50 or in some cases 60 or 70 years. These are documents that we may have a copy, a photostat really, from the 1940s, but we have no idea where the original is. And he's had researchers and auction houses and dealers sort of searching for those kinds of things. And when you're at this for 35 years, people pretty well know, if there's a document related to Lincoln and Jewish content, that Shapell's going to be interested. So sheer longevity of sort of collecting in the same paths certainly brings its rewards, but documents are literally all over the world. We have scanned documents in Australia and Japan, and we're tracking one in Turkey right now and in Italy, and they're just all over the world. And not all of those are diplomatic documents. Some of them, the ones in Japan, for example, were purchased in the 1980s by a Japanese businessman and then donated to a university there outside of Tokyo. So they are literally all over the world. In fact, one of the documents that you'll see in Lincoln and the Jews, the book, is from that university in Japan.
Yes. I recommend that you tell people about the book.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. No, nor do I. But Jonathan Sarna and Benjamin Shapell have written a wonderful book on Lincoln and the Jews, and it's lavishly and beautifully illustrated. It's sort of a coffee table book. But a couple of features besides the wonderful illustrations, which we as documentary editors love, that I would point out is that he has a chronology in the back of Lincoln's interactions with individual Jews, which again add up to a larger story here. And in the front, there is a version of what you'll see just outside on the wall, just outside the exhibit, which is this sort of wheel of relationships that Lincoln had with individual Jews, from the sort of center friends like Abraham Jonas and Issachar Zachary to people that were more tangential, ones that, for example, he may have ruled on a pardon or appointed to a small military commission or whatever. But it's significant to know that Lincoln appointed the first Jewish chaplain in American history, and the second, and the third. So these are all, this story is told in this wonderful book, and I think it's well worth purchasing and perusing. It's both physically beautiful, but also very very informative about a topic that's been too long ignored. Thank you very much for your attention. Enjoy the exhibit.